Welcome to Healthy Living. I'm Lori Johnson. Thanks for tuning in today. My guest is former FDA Commissioner Dr. Scott Gottlieb, who is also a regular contributor on CNBC and the author of the new book called Uncontrolled Spread: Why COVID-19 Crushed Us and How We Can Defeat the Next Pandemic. Dr. Gottlieb, thanks for being here. Great to see you.
Thanks for having me.
So I wanted to talk quickly about the last part of the title of your book, How We Can Defeat the Next Pandemic. The idea of another pandemic in our lifetime is really alarming to a lot of people who think the last one was 100 years ago, the Spanish flu. So maybe the next pandemic is going to be in another 100 years, certainly not in our lifetime. What are your thoughts about when we might experience another pandemic?
Well, look, it's unknown, and we always feared that there would be a pandemic with a novel strain of influenza, and we still face the same risk, if not greater risk, that there's going to be a novel strain of flu that could trigger a global pandemic. So we need to improve how we prepare against these kinds of threats. I think that there was a perception that a lot of the preparations that we had undertaken really back in 2005 to try to prepare ourselves for what we thought was going to be a pandemic involving a specific strain of flu, bird flu called H5N1, would prepare us against any kind of threat of this magnitude. And I think what we found in the setting of COVID is that we were ill prepared, that the preparations we had made, the things we thought we had done that would keep us safe really weren't adequate to this kind of a challenge. So it's unclear when the next pathogen is going to try to threaten us in this way. But I think our goal from a policy standpoint needs to be not just how do we mitigate the risk of a pandemic, but how do we prevent it altogether? And I think that there are things we can do to prevent this kind of episode from ever happening again.
And can you list some of those, starting with the most important?
Yeah, look, first, I think we need to think about building better capacities here domestically to try to scale the kind of response we need to deal with these kinds of threats. And that means having the capacity to deploy diagnostic testing at a large scale, having the capacity to manufacture biological drugs that we know are going to be a first line of defense against a pandemic like this. The antibody drugs, the Regeneron antibody drug and the Lilly antibody drug, where we really didn't have the adequate manufacturing capacity we need to be able to prepare those at the scale that was required. And even now we have shortages of those drugs. They're starting to be rationed again. We need a better capability to gather and disseminate information in a real-time fashion. CDC really wasn't up to that challenge. It's not an organization that's geared towards providing real-time information to inform active policy making. It's a very high science organization that's accustomed to doing very exquisite analyses, but taking months to do it often. So it couldn't surface the kind of real-time information we needed to try to inform current decisions. And then when they issued guidance to try to advise us on how we should be taking steps to reduce our individual risk and how businesses should be taking steps to reduce their risk, the guidances often weren't very well informed. They weren't articulated in a way that they could be actionable by consumers, where consumers could look at it and say, okay, this is what I need to do. This is what the agency is telling me based on this evidence. So we didn't have an organization capable of doing that. We sort of surmised that CDC would be up to that task, but it wasn't. We also thought that CDC would be able to deploy the kind of logistical response, deploy testing at a massive scale, and they didn't have that capacity. The third component, the third leg of the stool, if you will, is going to be more capacity to gather information overseas about these emerging risks. We've historically relied on international agreements with other countries and capacity building in hotspots. And so we've gone into regions where we know these kinds of viruses emanate from, and we've tried to build out capacities and enter into bilateral and multilateral agreements where nations agree to share information through bodies like the World Health Organization or the World Health Assembly. And we've seen time and again, in a time of crisis, countries don't share information. We've had this fiction that countries are just going to willingly they're host to an emerging pathogen, and they don't. And we've been fooled many times. And China also has been recidivist in this regard. They didn't disclose information about SARS-1 when that virus was spreading years ago, more than a decade ago. It wasn't until Canada actually had cases of SARS-1 in Toronto, and they sequenced the virus and discovered that it was a novel coronavirus, that China finally admitted that they had an outbreak with the virus. Up until that point, they were saying that it was a fungal infection causing a fungal pneumonia. And in this case, there was information that they withheld about SARS-2, about SARS-CoV-2, and they still haven't shared the source strains. They still haven't shared the original strains of the virus. And so we're going to need the capacity to go in and gather information, not just rely on the good graces of other countries to share it. And that means getting our foreign intelligence services more engaged in this mission. Historically, our foreign intelligence services like the CIA and the NSA really weren't that active in the public health mission. It was seen as something that was the domain of CDC, and public health officials didn't want the national security apparatus near that mission. They felt it would erode their capabilities overseas, that everyone with a white coat would be perceived to be a spy. We're not going to be able to afford that luxury anymore. Every other country gets their foreign intelligence services engaged in this mission. We're going to have to as well. And the final point on that is that, if anything, the COVID pandemic has conditioned countries to be even less forthcoming with information, because one of the things that COVID really normalized was the use of trade and travel restrictions as a way to try to contain outbreaks. And so now any country that's host to an outbreak of an emerging infection is going to be worried that if they raise their hand and divulge it, there's going to be travel restrictions imposed on them. Look at what happened with England when England said that they were host to B117, that new, more contagious variant that started to spread last spring. The first thing the French did was close the channel. So if anything, we've conditioned countries to be even less forthcoming, and it's going to behoove us to rely even more on our foreign intelligence agencies.
And so when you look back at what went wrong in the early stages of the pandemic, one of the things you pointed out was not being aware of the fact that this COVID-19 can spread, that there can be asymptomatic cases of that. Can you elaborate a little bit more about what went wrong in those early days?
Yeah, look, the fact that we didn't have a diagnostic test that could be deployed at scale was a source of a lot of our early challenges. First of all, because we didn't have a diagnostic test, we couldn't find the geographic and social compartments in which this virus was spreading. And so we wrongly assumed that it was spreading in ways that it wasn't. So to give you one example, early on, CDC and others assumed that there was a lot of spread through contaminated surfaces, what we call fomites. And that led to the decision to do the 15 days to slow the spread and have a simultaneous shutdown, really, of the whole country, an extraordinary decision to shut down a lot of commercial and recreational activity across the whole country, because CDC assumed that any city that was operating a mass transit system was going to be subject to the same kind of dense epidemic spread that New York was subject to. New York was on the brink of collapse. The healthcare system there was breached. They clearly needed to shut down activity within that city, but not every part of the country faced that level of spread. In some parts of the country, the virus still hadn't traveled to. But we wrongly assumed that the virus was everywhere because we couldn't test for it. So we not only didn't know where it was, we didn't know where it wasn't. And since we couldn't determine how it was spreading, we assumed that because we saw situations where there were a lot of cases emanating from a group gathering, but we couldn't trace it back to a single index case, we couldn't trace it back to a single sick person, we wrongly assumed that it must have been some contaminated surface. You'd see a situation where 30 people would be in a room, everyone would be fine, and then 25 people would get the infection. And so the assumption was there must have been a contaminated surface that 25 people came in contact with. But what actually was happening was there was someone who was asymptomatic in that setting who infected the other people, who never developed symptoms themselves, but went on to transmit the infection. But without a diagnostic test, we couldn't figure that out. So we wrongly assumed that it was the surfaces that was creating the spread. And so that's why for so long we were all wiping down our groceries and wiping down door handles, and spraying subway cars. We've now learned that fomites are a small contribution to the spread, contaminated surfaces. But without a diagnostic test, we couldn't tell that. And on the other point, back in the spring, when we shut down New York, there were other cities that faced a lot of risk. Clearly, New Orleans needed to shut down activity. Boston faced dense spread. Philadelphia, the parts of the Pacific Northwest, San Francisco. But the virus hadn't really traveled to Austin yet. It hadn't traveled to Jacksonville. There was a small enough number of cases there that we could still use testing, tracing, tracking as a way to contain the spread. We didn't need to shut down the city, but we didn't know that because we didn't have a diagnostic test. And so we ended up shutting down the whole country. And then when the virus eventually traveled to those parts of the country, when the South eventually had an epidemic in the summertime, people there said, look, we're not shutting down now because we've already did that in the spring. You told us we had to shut down in the spring. We really didn't have to, and we're done with the shutdowns. So it prevented us from being able to preserve the political capital to take the tough mitigation steps later when the virus eventually engulfed other parts of the country, because we fired that bullet right up front. We did the mitigation right up front because we didn't know where the virus wasn't. And so the lack of a diagnostic test was a source of a lot of our early challenges with this virus. And that really fell on CDC. CDC failed to roll out the diagnostic test that they had committed to, and they didn't have the capacity to scale that testing anyway. They should have recognized early on that they weren't going to be able to provide sufficient testing to keep up with a fast-moving epidemic, and there needed to be a decision made to turn to commercial manufacturers very early in this crisis, sometime in January. That decision wasn't made until the end of February, really, until we finally turned to commercial manufacturers in a robust fashion to try to scale testing in this country.
Yeah, it's a real shame, but yeah, we can definitely learn from those mistakes. We're going to take a quick break and be right back with Dr. Scott Gottlieb. The book is called Uncontrolled Spread: Why COVID-19 Crushed Us and How We Can Defeat the Next Pandemic. Stay with us.
Hey, if you're tired and exhausted all day, you can't think clearly, and you really just need a cup or even a pot of coffee to get through your day, then join me, Dr. Josh Axe, for this new series where I'm going to teach you how to transform your diet and use essential oils and supplements to get a better night's sleep.
Wake up to your best life. Call 1-800-700-7000 to get your free DVD or booklet of Protect Your Sleep today.
It's about the competition.
I kind of put that pressure on myself, and I think people had expectations.
It's about overcoming.
We use this phrase all the time: keep chopping, keep practicing hard.
It's about going the distance.
You know, I think as a father, it's my job, to lead. Just be the best husband and father I can be.
Watch Going the Distance with Sean Brown Saturday night at 7:30 on the CBN News Channel.
Orphans Promise is committed to loving and serving at-risk children, to helping keep families together, and to creating opportunities for strong and sustainable communities around the world. We're working in over 60 countries around the world, and with your help, we can do even more. There's an old African proverb I love that says, if you want to run fast, run alone. But if you want to run far, run together. At Orphans Promise, we want to run far so we can touch the lives of as many orphaned and vulnerable children as possible. But we don't want to go alone. We're out to change the world, one child, one family, one community at a time. Will you join us?
Welcome back to Healthy Living, continuing our discussion with Dr. Scott Gottlieb. The new book is called Uncontrolled Spread. So, Dr. Gottlieb, we're obviously still in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. What do you think is on the horizon? You've talked before about possibly Delta peaking and then maybe no more peaks. What are your thoughts about the future of this pandemic?
Well, look, the pandemic's been highly regionalized. Different parts of the country have experienced epidemic spread at different points in time. Delta swept through the South. The South had a very dense epidemic with Delta. Clearly, infections are declining there right now. The South has peaked. The only age category in which you still see some case growth is younger kids, school-age kids, because you're starting to see epidemics in the schools. But it's unclear what's going to happen in other parts of the country. I still believe that there's going to be a Delta wave in the Northeast and the North as kids go back to school, people return to work, and the colder weather starts driving people indoors. But I do believe after this Delta wave, odds are this is the last major surge of infection, and we're going to start to transition from the pandemic phase of this virus, at least here in the United States, to a more endemic phase where this virus becomes a persistent risk, like flu, where it comes back, but it settles into more of a seasonal pattern. And through a combination of, adjusting our lives to the risk of respiratory diseases and through vaccination, we're going to be able to deal with it. I think that this might be the last major wave of infection. The idea that this is going to continue to mutate very quickly and all these mutations are going to evade our tools and this is sort of going to be an endless crisis, I just don't see that. I mean, there's obviously a tail risk that you have a scenario like that where some new strain emerges that could defeat our vaccines entirely. But I think that that's a very remote possibility. It's more likely that this virus mutated very quickly over a short period of time. It's reached what we call a new fitness level. It's achieved a new level of fitness against human beings. But now it's going to settle down. It's not going to continue to mutate quite as quickly as it's been mutating over the last couple of years.
What do you think about booster shots regarding Americans?
Yeah, look, I'm on the board of Pfizer. Pfizer has filed an application with FDA requesting permission to start delivering booster shots. I think that there is a compelling case to be made that for older individuals who were vaccinated a long time ago, so people who were vaccinated last January, last December, you're starting to see declining efficacy over time. And while you're not seeing a sharp rise in severe cases, you're not seeing a sharp rise in really bad outcomes among people who've been fully vaccinated, hospitalizations, deaths, severe disease, you are seeing rising cases, infections, and rising symptomatic cases, particularly in older individuals who were vaccinated a while ago. And so I think that the data does support the premise of providing boosters, at the very least, to people who are older, people maybe over the age of 60 or 65. The data out of Israel shows an 11-fold reduction in the risk of infection for older individuals who were revaccinated, who received boosters, and about a 19-fold reduction in severe disease. And so the data does show a compelling impact, compelling efficacy for older individuals who receive a booster who got their original vaccination a long time ago.
What do you think about the WHO recommendation that people, instead of receiving a third shot, should give those shots to developing countries who haven't even had one shot yet?
Look, there's no question we need to be doing more globally to try to provide vaccine to countries that haven't been able to get access to it. The reality is it's really not a supply issue, or very soon it's not going to be a supply issue. We've delivered 5.8 billion doses of vaccine globally, 380 million here in the United States. There's been a lot of vaccine distributed. There are countries that haven't had good access to it, but the supply is going to be ample. There's a lot of supply in the system right now, and over the next 12 months, Pfizer, the company I'm on the board of, has said it's going to produce 4 billion doses. Moderna said they'll produce at least 3. AstraZeneca is going to produce billions of doses. J&J will produce billions of doses. China is going to continue to produce billions of doses. The Serum Institute in India is going to produce billions of doses. You're looking at a situation where we could have somewhere between 10 and 20 billion doses of vaccine over the next 12 months. There's 7.5 billion people in the world. 5.8 billion of them have already received a dose of vaccine, or maybe 2 doses of vaccine. So we're going to have supply. It's going to be a question of logistics, getting into those countries and providing the logistics on the ground to distribute the vaccines, which we're not doing a good job of. As far as the U.S. providing boosters, we're talking about maybe 40 million doses being used to provide boosters to senior citizens. This isn't a zero-sum game. The doses that are available in the U.S. are already bought and paid for in the U.S. The government's already bought those doses, and there's no way that they're going to ship those doses outside the U.S. As a matter of national security, the administration is going to hold on to enough doses to revaccinate the entire population, just as a hedge against what we don't know. So it's not a zero-sum game where if we use a dose here in the U.S., it's a dose that could have been shipped overseas. The doses that we would be using in the U.S. are doses that would stay in the U.S. So I don't think that that's a valid argument why we shouldn't be providing boosters. The public health and clinical arguments, I think, are a more robust discussion. But the idea that it's taking a dose away from someone else who could be using it in another country, it just doesn't work that way.
All right. We're going to take another quick break and be right back with Dr. Scott Gottlieb. The book is called Uncontrolled Spread.
Daddy?
Yeah, buddy?
How many nickels are in a dollar?
There are 20 nickels in a dollar.
How do birds fly? Does milk really make my bones stronger?
Yeah.
Daddy, when we die, will we go to heaven?
Do you have the answer to life's biggest question? Call the 700 Club. We'll help you find answers to the important questions life brings your way.
Watch breaking news, in-depth exclusive stories and programs from health to entertainment you won't find anywhere else. The CBN News Channel, a perspective you can trust. Enjoy credible news reporting from around the world. Discover inspiring programs and stories of hope, all in one place from a Christian perspective. The CBN News Channel, a perspective you can trust. To watch the CBN News Channel, download the app or visit cbnnewschannel.com.
Hello, I'm Dr. David Perlmutter, board-certified neurologist and #1 New York Times bestselling author. Wouldn't it be great to boost your energy, eliminate brain fog, and even reverse brain disease? Well, you can, and I'm going to show you how, along with some of the world's most well-respected brain experts, in this DVD, Protect Your Brain.
Get Protect Your Brain, a free DVD only from the Christian Broadcasting Network, featuring experts on the cutting edge of neuroscience and brain health.
No matter how many times you've failed in the past, you really can do this.
In Protect Your Brain, you'll discover simple strategies to keep your brain young and healthy. Improve your memory. Discover the gut-brain connection. In Protect Your Brain, get your free copy at cbn.com or call 1-800-700-7000.
If you want to improve the quality of your life, get the DVD Protect Your Brain and get it today.
Welcome back. Continuing our discussion with Dr. Scott Gottlieb, author of the new book called Uncontrolled Spread, Why COVID-19 Crushed Us and How We Can Defeat the Next Pandemic. Dr. Gottlieb, what are your thoughts about the proposed vaccine mandates for businesses of 100 employees or more, and also about the aspect that many of these employees who don't have vaccines have natural immunity?
Hey, look, on the second question, I think we need to recognize that people who have immunity that's acquired through infection, that immunity is durable and it appears quite robust. I think the question from a clinical standpoint is how long it's going to last. People who have immunity from infection, based on our general understanding, and there's still a lot we don't know about this virus, that immunity over time is going to wane, and probably those individuals will need to be vaccinated at some point in the future to maintain their immunity. But at least in the near term, immunity acquired through infection does appear to be robust. As far as the mandates are concerned, I think the federal government's well within their purview to mandate vaccines for federal employees, for the military. That's a question of readiness of the federal workforce. But mandating down to the level of small businesses with 100 more employees, I think that that's counterproductive. I don't think that we should be doing that. We need to ask ourselves what our goal is and whether or not by doing that, we're going to take something that has sort of been furtively political, the idea of getting vaccinated, and make it objectively political and harden people's positions against vaccines and vaccine mandates altogether. Right now, 76% of adults over the age of 18 have received at least one dose of vaccine. Most of them will complete the series, so about 90% of them will be fully vaccinated. Where are we going to get? So, if you look at childhood immunizations, which are mandated in schools, you get anywhere from 90 to 94% compliance with childhood immunizations, less for some vaccines. Where are we going to get with an adult vaccine like COVID? Maybe we'll get to 85%. I would argue on our current trajectory, we probably would have gotten to 80%. Maybe with a mandate on small businesses, we'll get to 85%. But is that last 5% really worth the cost in terms of the divisions and the challenges this is going to create? And the final point on this is that a lot of businesses that were considering mandates now might wait, because they're going to wait to see what the federal government does. And it's going to take the federal government months to implement this mandate if they're ever able to. And so you might have actually slowed down the rate of decision making in the private community. Now, I said final point. This is really the final point. I do believe the decision to get vaccinated is a collective decision. It's not just an individual decision, because it is affecting the community. But if we're going to allow entities to make a decision for the collective good about vaccines, that should be made at the lowest, at the most local level. So it's school board deciding to mandate vaccines for a local school district, a business deciding to do it on its own because that's the only way they can protect their workplace or protect their customers. I don't think the government should be telling businesses to do this. I think businesses should be free to make that decision on their own.
And when you talk about natural immunity, is there any way to accurately test whether a person has natural immunity?
Yeah, there's antibody tests that will test whether or not you have antibodies to the virus. And they're not that reliable, but generally if you repeat the test, if you have a positive test on an antibody test, I would repeat it. If you have two positive tests, that's pretty foolproof. But you do have a high rate of false positives, which means that test could sometimes say you have antibodies when you really don't. The tests themselves aren't good for quantifying the amount of antibodies, so they're not good for telling a person how many antibodies you have, therefore what the level of protection you have. They're good when they're used more in a binary sense, basically to tell you whether you have them or whether you don't. So if you have an antibody test and you're positive and you repeat it and you have a positive on the second result, that's a pretty good indication that you've probably been exposed to the virus and you've developed some immunity to the virus, assuming you haven't been vaccinated. Because if you've been vaccinated, that's another reason why you'd also test positive on those antibody screens.
We're going to take one final break and be right back with Dr. Scott Gottlieb, author of the new book, Uncontrolled Spread.
Region's first ROTC graduate student.
I'm Ephraim Graham, and this is Studio 5. Cruise with me as I discover the good things happening in the world of music, sports, television, and movies.
The fact that Ryan Coogler was going to be directing the film, I knew that something special was going to happen.
We'll chat with artists at the forefront of entertainment and explore the connection between popular culture and faith.
I asked my pastor, I said, well, does that mean I'm supposed to be a preacher? He says, well, no, you already have a pulpit.
Wednesday night at 8:30 on the CBN News Channel.
How'd you like to get a redo on your health, on your body, on your arteries, so you could have the energy you had 20 years ago? The great news is you can. I'm Dr. Mike Roizen, chair of the Wellness Institute at the Cleveland Clinic. I've written 4 New York Times bestsellers. But even better than having to read all that, you can listen to this DVD and watch it. Protect your heart? Yes, you can. Here's how.
Go to CBN.com or call 1-800-700-7000 for your free copy of Protect Your Heart. Let the medical experts show you their new discoveries on how to avoid heart disease and even reverse it. Easy steps to uncover the hidden dangers in your medicine cabinet, reduce stress, and get a complete do-over for your health. Call 1-800-700-7000. That's 1-800-700-7000. Or go to CBN.com to claim your free copy of Protect Your Heart.
Stay connected with CBN News all day across our platforms.
Continuing our discussion now with Dr. Scott Gottlieb, author of the new book called Uncontrolled Spread. Dr. Gottlieb, when do you think there will be a vaccine available for the kids?
Well, the vaccine right now is available for kids age 12 and above. The question is, when will we have one for kids age 5 to 11, and then for kids younger than that? I'm on the board of Pfizer, which has a vaccine that they're having advanced development right now for kids age 5 to 11. They've said that they're going to have the data from the clinical trial that's ongoing by the end of September. And assuming that data package is positive, and so far the interim data that's come out of that study looks encouraging, they'll be in a position to file for approval or authorization with the Food and Drug Administration within days. And so if you get a filing some point in early October, FDA has said that the review of that application is going to be a matter of weeks, not months. And so I interpret that, having been at the FDA and heard those words before, I interpret that to mean maybe 4 to 6 weeks that the FDA would take to review the application. So in the best case, if the data package is positive and FDA agrees and finds the vaccine to be safe and effective for children ages 5 to 11, I think you could potentially have a vaccine available by the end of October, so by Halloween. If it slips a little bit, slips a couple of weeks, and it's more like a 6-week review, maybe by mid-November. But I think that, the end of October, early November timeframe is an optimistic scenario, but an achievable scenario in terms of when a vaccine would be available for kids that young. Now, the vaccine for kids age 5 to 11 is basically the same formulation as the current vaccine, just in a lower dose. It's a 10 microgram dose instead of a 30 microgram dose, at least in the case of Pfizer. The vaccine for children ages 6 months to 4 years is going to be even a lower dose. It's going to be a 3 microgram dose. And the data on that vaccine, the study that's ongoing in children that young, will be available at some point in November. And so, if it's positive, the company could file at some point after that. So you could potentially see a vaccine for children ages 6 months to 4 years available, maybe before the end of this year, but certainly by early 2022 if things go well.
Interesting. All right. Well, unfortunately, we're out of time right now. Dr. Gottlieb, thanks so much for being with us. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks a lot.
And once again, the book is called Uncontrolled Spread, Why COVID-19 Crushed Us and How We Can Defeat the Next Pandemic. Thanks for tuning in to this edition of Healthy Living. I'm Lori Johnson, and we'll see you again next time.